Okay, thank you very much, everyone. I'm delighted to be here. And as Rolanda said, what I'm going to be doing today is giving you a little bit of a snippet of my book that I wrote on the lives and letters of Lucy and Henry Knox. And it's part my own analysis of their relationship over the course of the evolution of their relationship over the course of the Revolution, but it's also about their personal experiences during the Revolution. And their letters are extraordinarily rich and dynamic. But I do want to just take 1 year of their life during the Revolution to illustrate several things. Number one, to tell a well-known story. I think everyone is familiar with the Yorktown campaign, and I don't think anyone will be surprised when you find out who wins the Yorktown campaign. But it's also a story, a well-known story of Washington and Knox's collaboration, and they did work together throughout the Revolutionary War. Henry Knox was a Boston bookseller before the war, and he meets George Washington 3 days after Washington took command of the Continental Army. And Washington spotted something in the younger Knox, and ultimately Knox became a commander of the Continental Artillery, as well as a major general. But this is also a little-known story, because historians rarely, while they focus on the great events, the great military events, and exploits, rarely do they look at the private lives of these individuals and the domestic relationships that they had. And Washington and Knox had a very close friendship in addition to a professional collaboration. Toward the end of his life, Washington looked back upon 20-plus years of working with Henry Knox and being friends with Henry Knox. And he wrote to John Adams on his friendship in 1798. He said, "I can say with truth that there is no man in the United States with whom I have been in habits of greater intimacy, no one whom I have loved more sincerely, nor any for whom I have had a greater friendship." So these men were personally very close, as well as professional men who were engaged in both military events and politics. Then, in some ways, I want to tell a timeless story today. I think we all, especially living in this area, know members of the military, and perhaps a number of you have served in the military. And you know, especially during a time of war, soldiers at the front are essentially dealing with a two-front war. They're juggling enormous professional responsibilities of fighting a war, a very dangerous occupation, of course, but they're also, they have competing responsibilities at the home front. And they're constantly dealing with that side of things, with letters from home, communications from home. And what I want to do in this talk is kind of give you some illustration as to how Washington and Knox's friendship developed over the course of the Yorktown campaign, but also how these men juggled very difficult and in some ways very painful personal experiences during this year. Now, in addition to George and Henry being very good friends and close friends, Martha Washington was also friends with Henry Knox's wife, who was Lucy Flucker Knox. She was younger, just as Knox was younger than Washington, but Martha and Lucy got to know one another during the various winter encampments that the Continental Army experienced earlier in the war. And they very much liked one another, and they cared very deeply about one another. So we'll see some elements of that friendship in this talk. Now, oh, and by the way, the silhouette, the kind of crazy silhouette you've got there, that will stand in for Lucy Knox. Unfortunately, no portrait of Lucy has survived. And so the only image that we have of her is this silhouette that was done in the 1790s, about 20, 25 years after the period we're talking about. And I think it was making fun of her hairdo and her hat style in Philadelphia during Washington's administration. But it'll have to do for us because, again, it's the only image that we have of her. Now, I want to take us back to 1781 and the beginning of 1781. Now, 1781 opened very grimly for the nation. The war for independence had entered its 7th year. Victory seemed very far away. Indeed, many of the number of the southern states, Georgia, South Carolina, and even North Carolina, were under British occupation. The main Continental Army at its winter had a very difficult encampment at Morristown, New Jersey. The soldiers were hardly paid, they were hardly fed, and the winter of 1780, 1781 was the harshest in memory. And in fact, things got so bad that several Continental Army regiments even mutinied on New Year's Day to demand better conditions or a discharge from the Army. But there were other things that made 1781 open on a grim note. In Virginia, which had, for the most part, escaped the depredations of war, of the Revolution up to this point, early in January of 1781, now British General Benedict Arnold landed in Virginia, up the James River Valley and on the peninsula, with 1,500 soldiers, 1,500 redcoats. And Virginia was almost defenseless at this point in time. And so British soldiers pretty much rampaged unhindered throughout the countryside around here. Now, moreover, in addition to public tidings being very, very grim, Washington and Knox both felt personal pessimism with their own private lives that winter. Washington's apprehensions focused, for the most part, in early 1781 on his beloved mansion and estate, Mount Vernon. He had not seen Mount Vernon since the beginning of the war. He had not visited Mount Vernon once. But he knew from letters from his estate manager, Lund Washington, that Mount Vernon was deteriorating. Its fields were becoming barren. Its outbuildings were becoming dilapidated. And Washington very much worried that his financial situation was deteriorating considerably, and that he might be going broke while fighting this revolution for the country. In addition to that, he also had his stepson to worry about. This is 26-year-old John Parke Custis, or Jackie. He was 26 years old in 1781. And Jackie proved to Washington to be a disappointment. He was neither soldier, nor scholar, nor farmer. He always ignored his studies as a boy, much to Washington's frustrations. But Custis also spent the Revolution largely avoiding military and public service. Instead, he married a young sweetheart named Nellie Calvert, and then he proceeded to spend his way through his inherited fortune by first buying and then mismanaging a large plantation in Fairfax County. So Washington had a number of private concerns in early 1781. Knox has his own apprehensions as 1781 begins. Now, Knox and Lucy were staunch patriots, but all of her family were Tories, were loyalists. And in fact, Lucy's father, who is Thomas Flucker Sr., he had been, right before the Revolution, the Royal Secretary of Massachusetts Bay. And early in the war, he fled Boston when the Continental Army was able to capture that city, but he fled to London, where he was awaiting what he expected to be an eventual British triumph. Moreover, Knox had two brothers-in-law who were officers in the British Army and who were fighting on the opposing side in this contest. Now, all of Lucy's kin were angry with her for the choices she had made at the war's outbreak, and they cut off all communication with her. So she had no contact, no news about any of her family throughout the war. Now, she was only 18 when the war began, and she was alone for much of the time due to Knox's military service, and she suffered emotionally and physically during the war because of the pain she felt about her family's abandonment of her. She terribly missed Henry when he was absent on military operations. And she also experienced during the first several years of the war, 3 difficult pregnancies. And one of her babies, a little girl, died just 3 months after her birth. So these were very painful years for her. And her health sharply declined during the war. And Knox was constantly worried about her, not only her physical well-being, but her emotional well-being. And then in early 1781, Knox discovered that Lucy and Henry discovered that Lucy was again expecting another child. It was her 4th pregnancy in 5 years. Now, of course, amid these domestic problems, the war is continuing to go on, and both Knox and Washington, again, were in the midst of fighting a difficult, challenging war. Now, in the spring of 1781, Knox and Washington and the Continental Army's High Command held a joint military conference with their French allies. And they met, French officers and the Continental Army's High Command met at Wethersford, Connecticut, which is just outside of Hartford, Connecticut, to decide what military actions the French and main Continental Army would engage in during the coming campaign season. And at this conference, Washington met with his counterpart, who you can see up there, was the French general, the Comte de Rochambeau. Rochambeau commanded a 5,000-man army, a French army that was then in Newport, Rhode Island. The main Continental Army was in the Hudson Highlands, just north of New York City. And it was during this conference that Washington learned that the French Caribbean fleet, which was down in the Caribbean, of course, Washington and Knox learned that the French Caribbean fleet, commanded by the Admiral Francois de Grasse, or the Comte de Grasse, de Grasse planned to sail northward that summer to support any operation that the 2 Allied generals might embark upon. So they had a decision to make at Wethersford as to where to strike. Now this map shows the kind of the strategic situation in North America at the beginning of, or in May of 1781. The main British Army was in New York City. The British were captured New York City early on in the war, and they made it their main base in North America. It was the location of the largest British Army in America. It was also where the British Royal Navy North American Squadron was located. But there was another British force down in Virginia. And in May of 1781, it was no longer commanded by Benedict Arnold. Rather, it was now commanded by a British general named Charles Lord Cornwallis. And Cornwallis had moved into Virginia with about 6,000 men in April of 1781. And just like Arnold before him, Cornwallis met very little resistance, and he continued to march up and down the peninsula here, pretty much unheeded, with very little resistance. So the key question that Washington and Rochambeau had to make was where to strike. Where to strike, at New York or in the Chesapeake. And they decided, well, Knox and Washington wanted to attack New York. They thought that that was where the main British force was, and that's where they should aim their efforts. The French commander, Rochambeau, wanted to concentrate against the British in the Chesapeake. But ultimately, the decision ultimately belonged to the French fleet commander, de Grasse. And it also depended upon how long de Grasse could stay in North American waters before he had to return to the Caribbean. Now, so from mid-May, and really throughout the early summer, the Army commanders waited for final word from de Grasse. De Grasse kept his cards very close to his vest about where he was ultimately going to go. And this period, the summer of 1781, was extraordinarily tense because there was no word from de Grasse, and for Washington and Rochambeau and Knox, the stakes were very, very high. Now, during this period of waiting, Knox received a personal letter from his younger brother. His younger brother was named William, and he was living in Boston. And he wrote to Henry in early August that Lucy's brother, Thomas Flucker Jr., we don't have an image of him as well, so I put this kind of stock image of a British officer during the Revolution. But Henry's brother said that Lucy had received a sealed letter from her brother. Now, this was the first communication that Lucy had ever received during the war. And Knox hoped it signaled a bid for reconciliation. So William sent the sealed letter to Henry, and Henry looked upon it initially as good news. Now, Lucy was not there at the time. She was, in August of 1781, traveling in the Hudson Valley up around Albany to the north, probably, most likely for health reasons. So Knox opened the letter and he read it, and it contained bad news. As he wrote to his brother William, the same day he got the letter, he said, "The letter which you enclosed to your sister and which I opened contains bad news. It informs that circumstances had so preyed on Mr. Flucker's mind as to cause of a very severe illness from which he would never recover, and that it was expected that the next packet would bring some dismal news." So in other words, Lucy's father in London is dying. Now, Knox told his brother that he just could not forward that letter to Lucy by post. She was already in the 5th month of her pregnancy, and Henry continued in his letter to his brother that Lucy will be afflicted by the letter and the news beyond moderation. So he realized he was going to have to share that news about her father with his wife face to face. Now, days after learning about Thomas Flucker's fatal illness, Henry and Washington get word from de Grasse that de Grasse was heading to the Chesapeake and that he could only stay in the waters off the Chesapeake until mid-October. And so as a result, suddenly, in mid-August, Knox and Washington found themselves overwhelmed with the Herculean task of organizing and overseeing the Army's 400-mile march to the south. Now, during these busy days in mid-August, Lucy did return to her husband's headquarters. Henry did inform Lucy about her father's illness. And this conversation, although there's no record of it, it must have been very highly distressing for both Knox and his wife, as you can imagine. Because shortly afterwards, Knox wrote another letter to his brother, and he wrote about the ongoing Southern operation, as it was called. And he said, this Southern operation, which Knox very much supported, Henry wrote, "This Southern operation deranges my little family and creates a distress only known to domesticated minds." So here you can see how his personal life is impacting his professional responsibilities as a military soldier, and it's creating almost unbearable stress in his mind. But he was desperately worried about leaving his wife during this operation alone so late in her pregnancy, particularly because of her distress over her father. Plus, Lucy had to take care of the Knox's 2 surviving children, the oldest of which was a 5-year-old little girl also named Lucy, but there was also a 15-month-old boy named Hal. And so to deal with his problems, to deal with this personal problem, Knox apparently decided to go to George and Martha Washington for advice on what to do. Now here too, we have no record of what transpired in their conversation, but I suspect that one of the Washingtons proposed that during the military operation, Lucy and the children travel to Mount Vernon to stay with Mrs. Washington, as Martha herself was planning to depart for Mount Vernon as soon as the operation got underway. Now again, Martha Washington and Lucy Knox were very close during the war, and they had spent a number of winter encampments together, and again, they very much cared for one another. And so, as Knox wrote to his brother, the General and Mrs. Washington prefers Mrs. Knox to take a trip to Virginia, and she seems inclined to accept. So here were the Washingtons opening their house, their home, in order to accommodate their very close friends here. Now, at the end of August, as the combined armies were moving out of New York State, a dispatch arrived from Virginia with news that Cornwallis's army had marched upon Yorktown, a small port hamlet on the York River, a dozen or so miles from the old state capital of Williamsburg. And Washington speculated that Cornwallis was moving to Yorktown to wait for the Royal Navy's North American Squadron to come and evacuate them back to New York City. He thought that Cornwallis was about ready to leave Virginia after creating all sorts of mayhem. Now, the possibility of a naval evacuation of Cornwallis was soon confirmed when Washington's spies in New York City informed the commander that indeed the Royal Navy squadron in New York was preparing to sail off somewhere very, very soon. So it made it even more imperative that this operation be done and be completed in a timely fashion before the British could rescue Cornwallis down here. Now, Allied soldiers began departing the Hudson Highlands and marching south into New Jersey on August 20th. And they reached Philadelphia about 10 days later. And the Knoxes were apparently, they traveled with the army across New Jersey in late August. Now, once they got to Philadelphia on their way to Virginia, the Knoxes decided to place their 5-year-old daughter, little Lucy, in an eminent boarding school, as they called it, so that she could continue her education during the operation, so that she would not fall behind in learning her ABCs and such. And the Continental Army remained in Philadelphia for several days. Now, as the Army and as Lucy Knox and the officers were preparing to leave, Lucy began to hesitate about leaving Philadelphia and leaving her daughter. She was very, very close to her daughter. Her daughter was born in 1776. Lucy and little Lucy survived a very dangerous smallpox inoculation in 1777. Little Lucy almost died from the inoculation, and they had never been apart from one another throughout the entire war, so they were very, very close. So Lucy didn't really want to part with her daughter, but Henry desperately wants his wife to travel to Mount Vernon to be with Mrs. Washington for the sake of her own emotional and physical health. And therefore, I think Knox then went again to George Washington and requested that Washington himself reiterate his and Martha's invitation for Lucy to come to Mount Vernon. And therefore, on the morning of September 5th, Washington picked up his pen and he wrote a brief note to Henry. And the only thing it said was, "Present my compliments to Mrs. Knox and repeat to her my wishes that she would spend her time at Mount Vernon, if it is convenient and agreeable for her to go to Virginia." And that nudge did the trick. Lucy at last finally agreed that she would go. She would leave her daughter. And thus the Knoxes soon left Philadelphia. Now, Washington himself had left the American capital right after he penned this note. He penned this letter, which is dated Philadelphia, on the morning of September 5th. And now, for Washington, his stay in Philadelphia had been a very difficult ordeal. He had to deal with throngs of well-wishers and congressmen who demanded briefings, in addition to carrying out his arduous military tasks. And worst of all, from Washington's point of view, is that by early September, he had heard no word from de Grasse or the situation of the French fleet So he was very nervous and very much on edge during his stay in Philadelphia. And in fact, Washington wrote to another officer he was very close to, the Marquis de Lafayette, that he was all impatience and anxiety concerning the status of the French fleet. Would they beat the British, or would the British successfully evacuate Cornwallis? Well, in the afternoon of September 5th, later after he had written to Henry and Lucy, Washington was leaving Philadelphia, and he was heading to the south to Head of Elk, where some of the heavier baggage of the armies was to be transported by water down to Yorktown in the peninsula. And while he was on the road, he was met by a messenger who brought him news, the very good news, that Admiral de Grasse and his French fleet of 30 ships had been sighted in Virginia waters, and that it now covered the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay. Thus, Cornwallis was trapped. Later that day, when General Rochambeau came down the Delaware River from Philadelphia by boat, he saw Washington. And as Rochambeau later wrote, he said, he saw Washington, quote, waving his hat at me with demonstrative gestures of the greatest joy. Washington was a pretty staid individual, but he couldn't control how happy he was. And when Rochambeau landed, Washington gave him a bear hug because he was so relieved that de Grasse had made it. Now, Washington's private joys grew several days later when he treated himself to a 3-day visit to Mount Vernon on his way to the peninsula here. And there he saw his estate for the first time in 6 years, and he saw that it was indeed in a deteriorating condition, but he was so happy just to be back home after many, many years of service. He also saw for the first time his 4 grandchildren that he had never met before. And so it was a joyous 3-day reprieve from the burdens of command and the responsibilities of command. Now, he also saw his stepson, and he did see that Jackie had not really mended his ways very much, but Jackie did request to go to Yorktown and serve as a personal aide to Washington. And Washington agreed to let him join the army down in Yorktown, thinking perhaps exposure to self-sacrificing Continental officers might bolster the young man's character. Now, on the road south from to Williamsburg, which is where the armies were gathering, on the way from Mount Vernon to Williamsburg, Washington received another update about the French fleet. And he got his first reports that de Grasse and his fleet had not only engaged, but that it had repulsed the British rescue fleet off the Virginia coast. And again, Washington was beside himself with joy, because now he knew that because the British had to retreat back to New York, Cornwallis was, for all intents and purposes, captured already. And several days after learning about this, Washington actually had a conference of war with de Grasse aboard de Grasse's flagship, the Ville de Paris. And Knox was on this, at this conference and did go aboard the great the great French warship. Now, probably the high point or the most memorable moment of this visit, this conference of war, was when the 6'2" Admiral de Grasse greeted the slightly shorter General Washington with another bear hug, several kisses on his cheeks, and de Grasse said, mon cher petit général. Washington was not used to being called small by anyone, but de Grasse was someone who could legitimately call him small. But they worked out, this was an important conference because de Grasse agreed that he would keep the Caribbean fleet at the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay until the end of October in order to wrap up the operation successfully against Cornwallis. Now, Lucy Knox, meanwhile, had arrived at Mount Vernon around the same time Henry and George Washington were aboard the Ville de Paris. And she and her one-year-old son, Henry, or Master Hal, as he was called, both parents called the 15-month-old boy Master Hal, and they were very warmly greeted by Martha at Mount Vernon. And Lucy, the first letter that has survived that Lucy wrote to Henry down here at Yorktown, the first letter she wrote from Mount Vernon was, she said, she met a very kind reception from the good lady at this place. And she said how much she loved Mount Vernon, what a beautiful house it was. And then Lucy added that her time in the great mansion also made her, as she said, ardently wish for a home of my own. Like that. I mean, who wouldn't want a house like that? But she was reminding Henry of his domestic duties as provider of the family, and that she had not had a home of her own for 6.5 years since she and Henry had fled Boston at the outset of the war. Now, Lucy wrote this letter where she said she ardently wished for a house like Mount Vernon on September 29th, 1781. And at the very moment Lucy was writing, Washington and Knox and the combined French and American armies were completing their march from Williamsburg, which is where they had concentrated, over to Yorktown. And you can see this map that is up on the screen there. This is a very good map of the siege of Yorktown. And you can see the British entrenchments in and around the port town. The American army was on the right flank of the British. The French were more in the center. The area to the left, the Allied left, was very swampy, and so the Allied forces didn't put many troops in that area. But you can see here in the lower right, you can see where Washington's headquarters and Knox's headquarters were located. They're well marked on the battlefield today, and they were actually quite close to one another. So these are the lines that begin to take form on September 29th. Now, it was also around this time that Jackie Custis arrived at the American encampment. And when he arrived, he not only brought a letter from Lucy to Henry, but he told Henry, the artillery commander, that his 15-month-old son, Master Hal, was, as Custis put it, a monstrous fine fellow. And that was a comment that really delighted Knox to hear about his son. And in fact, he repeated that comment in a letter he soon wrote to Lucy. But Custis also wrote from Yorktown to his mother. And he wrote more somberly that the Yorktown encampment was very sickly, especially for the runaway slaves who had previously escaped with the British Army. Indeed, Custis wrote, he said, "I've seen numbers of runaway slaves lying in the woods, dead. The mortality that has taken place among the wretches is really incredible." So this was a sickly encampment. And that was a reality in the 18th century. Whenever you had large concentrations of people, diseases and such spread with great rapidity and great suddenness. And among the dead that Custis saw were some of the slaves from Mount Vernon who had escaped to the British during the 1781 campaign. But Custis did reassure his mother that he was personally fine, and George Washington himself, his stepfather, looks very well, as Custis put it. Now, Lucy was, going back to Mount Vernon, Lucy was now entering in early October her 7th month of pregnancy. And even though she received a warm welcome at Mount Vernon, she was unwell and lonesome. And her husband's letters didn't really help matters much. Henry did write to Lucy, and some of those letters are reproduced in the book I mentioned at the outset. But they were short letters. They were quite short letters, and Henry explained that they were so short because he had plenty of responsibilities. He was arranging the American artillery for the bombardment of Yorktown. And then on October 16th, but she still felt neglected. But on October 16th, Lucy hit rock bottom. A packet of letters arrived from Yorktown on October 16th. And there was a letter for Martha. There was a letter for Nellie Calvert, Jackie's wife, who was staying at Mount Vernon. But there was no letter for Lucy. Henry had slipped up. He had not included a letter in that packet. And so Lucy wrote, and she's feeling pretty down. She wrote, "Mrs. Washington and Mrs. Custis have been made happy by the receipt of long letters from their husbands, while I, poor unhappy girl, am not worthy of a line." And then she kind of digs in the knife. She continues, she says, "The general's letter," it's Washington's letter, "informs her of every maneuver, however trifling, which has taken place since the opening of the trenches." So she's saying, you know, he has time to write long, detailed letters, but you never tell me anything about what you're doing at work. One of those kinds of lines. But she really was in some distress. Now, in this letter that Washington wrote to Martha, which has not survived, Martha Washington destroyed all of their correspondence upon his death, tragically for historians and for many of us who are interested in these people. But he seems in his letter to Martha that arrived on the 16th to invite her and Nellie Calvert to Williamsburg to await the end of the siege. Because Lucy wrote at the letter's end to Henry, "Martha sets off tomorrow for Williamsburg along with Nellie Calvert." Lucy, of course, could not go because of her condition, and the last thing you wanted a woman in an advanced stage of pregnancy was in a large, sickly encampment. Now, she was already distressed and worried about her father's health. She misses her husband and is worried about his safety. And at the very last line of the letter, she wrote, "When I retire to my room, I have no companion but my little boy, who I hug and weep over." So she was having a very difficult time emotionally during the siege. However, as Lucy was writing this, things were beginning to look up. In fact, Knox himself, as she was writing, Knox was probably in his headquarters tent writing her another letter, albeit another short letter. But in his letter of the 16th, he wrote to Lucy how, and this is from the letter, "The night before last, the Allies had stormed the enemy's 2 advanced works with very little loss." And what he was describing in that one sentence was the famous attacks on redoubts 9 and 10, excuse me, 9 and 10 by French and Continental regiments. And with their capture, Henry assured his wife that the operation's end was near at hand. And he said, "The fate of the enemy is drawing nigh." So he was telling her that this operation was almost over and they would be together again. And indeed, he was right. The day after he wrote this letter, a lone British drummer boy appeared atop the enemy parapet, beating a parley on the morning of October 17th. And almost immediately, a British officer joined the drummer boy, waving a white handkerchief. So in short, Cornwallis wanted to surrender. And so the Army's leaders began negotiating capitulation terms. And then 2 days later, on the 19th of October, at precisely 8 a.m., Henry picked up his pen once more, and he wrote at that early hour, he said, "so that he might be the first to communicate the good news to the charmer of my soul, a glorious moment for America. This day, Lord Cornwallis and his army march out and piles their arms in the face of our victorious army." And so he was telling her, you know, in essence, the operation had ended, and it had ended in a triumphant fashion. Now, This was actually one of the longest letters Henry wrote from Yorktown, because now that the surrender was in process, he had more time to devote to his wife. But as he was explaining some of the details of the surrender negotiations between the Continental and the British officers, a knock came at his tent pole demanding that he instantly go to Washington's nearby headquarters. There was some issue that needed Knox's attention at Washington's headquarters. And so Henry rather cryptically and hurriedly finished this letter of the 19th, and he wrote that his brother William had heard from a pair of Lucy's distant cousins in Halifax, and that they had written to William with news from England that your dear connections were all well. And I'm not sure exactly what she was referring to, but I think it was the first inkling that Lucy and Henry had that perhaps Thomas Flucker, against the odds, was recovering from the illness from which he had been expected to die from. Now, around the time Henry was writing this good news, all of this good news to Lucy, Martha Washington and Nellie Custis arrived in Williamsburg from Mount Vernon. And they were just a dozen miles from their husbands farther down the peninsula. And now both ladies, as soon as they arrived, probably felt happy that Cornwallis had surrendered, for it meant that their spouses had survived the siege unscathed. However, any joy that they felt and relief they experienced proved to be short-lived, because either very late in the operation or just after the surrender ceremony, Jackie Custis took ill. He became gravely ill. Because the Yorktown encampment had actually grown fouler and sicker by the day, Custis soon caught what was called a camp fever. And he was immediately removed from the encampment, and he was taken to a plantation house called Eltham, which is about 30 miles up the York River. It's around where West Point is today, near the mouth of the York River. And there he received round-the-clock care from doctors, as well as from Martha and Nellie, who rushed to his bedside, of course. But nothing stopped his sinking every day. And it soon became very clear that he was going to die. And as soon as that became clear, Washington himself was summoned from Yorktown to Eltham. And he arrived on November 5th, just in time to witness his stepson's demise. And the following day, Washington wrote to one of his aide-de-camps. He wrote, "I came here in time to see Mr. C breathe his last about 8 o'clock yesterday evening." Again, Washington wrote that to one of his aides on the 6th of November. And because he had to tend to his devastated wife and a grieving widow, Washington told his aide that he could not possibly rejoin the army for 3 or 4 days. Now, ever mindful, and always mindful, I should say, of his public responsibilities, Washington felt compelled to explain and justify his absence from the army. And so he continued to his aide. He said, "The deep and solemn distress of the mother and the affliction of the wife of this amiable young man requires every comfort in my power to afford them. The last rites of the deceased I must also see performed." So here, again, you can see in Washington's case, he's got these crushing public responsibilities, but now he's got to balance those with his private responsibilities, which are even more burdensome emotionally. Washington was very deeply affected by Custis's death. Even though he didn't always agree with the decisions Jackie Custis had made in his life, he had known Jackie since he was 4 years old when he married Martha in 1759. And so his passing was certainly very painful for him. Now, what about Lucy and Henry? Well, Henry left Yorktown for Mount Vernon in early November. either the 4th or the 5th of November, after he had arranged for the transport of his artillery train back up north to around New York City in the Hudson Highlands. And after he had arranged that, he left for Mount Vernon to see Lucy and to be reunited with his wife. Now, he reaches Mount Vernon on the 10th, and he probably learned about Jackie Custis's death on the road. And he was probably the first to inform those at Mount Vernon, or one of the first at those at Mount Vernon, to explain that Washington and Martha had lost their only son. And everyone agreed this was a terrible, terrible tragedy and blow to the commander. And Knox wrote to a friend the day after he arrived at Mount Vernon. He arrives on the 10th of November. The following morning, he wrote to one of his acquaintances. He said, "His Excellency the General and Mrs. Washington, amidst flattering public prospects, have received the most fatal blow to their domestic felicity. The amiable Mr. Custis, Mrs. Washington's only child, has just been obliged by the rigid hand of fate to pay his last debt to nature." So again, he realized this was a grievous blow at the pinnacle of Washington's military career. And then Henry turned to his own family matters, and he continued to this correspondence. He said, "Mrs. Knox seems inclined to go to Philadelphia to lie in for the birth of her next child, but we cannot determine on the matter until Mrs. Washington arrives. Suppose she should decide to go to Philadelphia." And what I think Knox was saying here was that Lucy and Henry had most likely decided how best to console and comfort their grieving friends, a duty that they felt they especially owed to the Washingtons after their recent kindnesses to them. In other words, if Martha decided to accompany George Washington to Philadelphia, where he was to go to brief the Continental Congress on his recent victory, if Lucy wanted to accompany her husband to Philadelphia, Martha might especially wish to have a close female friend at her side, like Lucy. And so the Knoxes were delaying heading back to Philadelphia in order to console their friends, but also to accompany them if they wanted that. Now, the Washingtons did arrive at Mount Vernon 2 days later on the 13th of November, and the general told the Knoxes that he and Martha would indeed go to Philadelphia together, but they couldn't possibly leave for another week. And so as a result, Henry decided he had to get Lucy to Philadelphia as soon as possible. She was already in the 9th month of her pregnancy, and she needed to get safely to Philadelphia if she was to go at all. Plus, the Knoxes very much wanted to see their little girl, Lucy. So they left the mansion within a day or so of the 13th of November, and we don't know much about their journey overland from Mount Vernon to Philadelphia, but I think it was a pretty difficult one. During the journey, Knox had planned to meet with the governor of Maryland, Thomas Sim Lee, in order to arrange for the return of some ordnance and horses that belonged to the state of Maryland that were used in the Yorktown campaign. But at the last minute, Knox wrote to the governor and said he had to cancel the meeting because of circumstances beyond my control. So in other words, I think Lucy's health was evolving in an alarming way, and that he had to get her to Philadelphia as soon as possible. So but they did reach Philadelphia safely, and she was able to be in Philadelphia safely for the remainder of her pregnancy. Now, the Washingtons, meanwhile, they arrived at Philadelphia a week or so later, where Washington briefed the Continental Congress on his victory, and where the Knoxes and the Washingtons were reunited. Now, the public and private crises that both the Washingtons and the Knoxes experienced in 1781 began to resolve themselves at the end of that year. In December of 1781, public affairs certainly looked brighter. The year that had begun with riots and mutinies by Continental soldiers and an invasion of Virginia had ended with the triumphant capture of an entire British army. Virginia was cleared of her enemies, and the alliance between the United States and France seemed stronger than ever. The private crises facing both of these families also began to resolve themselves as Christmas approached. The Knoxes saw their private trials and tribulations come to a close that December. Arriving in Philadelphia in the nick of time, Knox was able to settle Lucy into comfortable rooms. The Knoxes were reunited with their 5-year-old little Lucy. They also seem to have received confirmation toward the year's end that, against expectations, Thomas Flucker Sr. had indeed survived his recent illness and would not die. Also, and perhaps best of all for Knox, on December 10th, his third child, or his fourth child, was born. Marcus Camillus Knox was born on the 10th of December. And I was able to date the date of his birth by a letter that Knox wrote to another friend he had in the Continental Army, Nathaniel Greene. On the 12th of December, Henry wrote to Nathaniel Greene. He said, "Mrs. Knox 2 days ago presented me with another son, whom I should name after you were it not for the confounded name given by your father." Here he's making fun of the funny way that Nathaniel is spelled. "Therefore, I shall call the boy after some Roman whose character I think you may like." Marcus Camillus was a 5th and 4th century BC Roman statesman and soldier. So for the Knoxes, the year ends on a high note, on a positive note. But the Washingtons also found some private consolation that winter in Philadelphia. Martha, in particular, continued to grieve over the loss of her only son, but she and the general agreed while in Philadelphia that they would essentially adopt the 2 youngest grandchildren of Jackie, their 2 youngest grandchildren, because Nellie Custis, now a widow, was still grieving for the loss of her husband, and because Nellie had not fully recovered from her last childbirth, which was that previous spring, she seemed in no condition to raise all 4 young children on her own. So George and Martha agreed to take then 2-year-old Eleanor and 8-month-old George Washington Parke Custis into their household and to raise the children themselves. And indeed, George and Martha did raise those 2 children for the next 16 years. Now, the decision to adopt these 2 Custis children particularly helped Martha deal with Jackie's death. As one of Martha's biographers has written, the prospect of raising these little folks, which is how George referred to his 2 grandchildren, the prospect of raising these little folks renewed, quote, Martha's sense of purpose in life like nothing else could have. So even for the Washingtons, even though it was a tragic year, it did end on a high note, and it certainly ended on a high note in terms of public affairs. So I think 1781, this story, it's a complicated story, but I think this story of 1781 with regard to the Knoxes and Washingtons is certainly a story of great historical moment, but I think it's also a lesser known but no less compelling story of family and friendship. And I think it illustrates how beneath the surface of great events, there are always momentous private events that are happening in these people's lives. And I think it's something that, again, if you've been in the military and you've been in such situations, you can certainly relate to. And in some ways, I think what they experienced is a timeless experience of soldiers of all ages. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hamilton. Does anybody have any questions? you, are the photographs that you refer to in your book as well?
Some of them are. Some of the images are. There are not a lot of images in the book, but a lot of these images are certainly available, on Wikipedia or online. So, but yeah, did you have a question about one of them?
Another question, if I may. The book is primarily the history that you describe, or primarily the letters reproduced?
The book is predominantly the letters that Lucy and Henry wrote to one another, and they're annotated. So in the notes, I explained who some of the people who are mentioned are, and I elaborate on some situations that might not be clear in the letters themselves. But each section of the book is introduced by I introduced that section by telling the reader overall what was happening in their lives. So you get some narration as to the course of their war and the evolution of their relationship. But I try to let the letters speak for themselves because I think they're very accessible letters. And I think they really relate. They speak in a language that we can all relate to today. Yeah.
What was DeGrasse doing in the Caribbean that prevented him from coming sooner and made him have to leave?
Yeah, the main reason he had to leave was because the French had very valuable sugar colonies down in the Caribbean that they wanted to protect. There was a British fleet that was operating down there, but I think DeGrasse, one of the reasons DeGrasse was willing to leave the Caribbean during the summer and early fall months was because it was hurricane season. And hurricanes hit the Caribbean much more than they do this area of the world. So I think part of it was just to protect his fleet from any possible hurricane action, but also he had to return, and he stayed to the end of November, which not surprisingly is the end of hurricane season. So I think even though they didn't have an official date back then.
Any other questions?
Yeah.
Did you consider other families or other wives in this book, like the Greens?
Yeah, I mean, obviously I concentrate on Lucy and Henry. Yeah, there are some letters, some very good letters between Nathaniel Greene and his wife, Katie Greene, that are almost as interesting, although Nathaniel Greene tended to dominate his wife in the correspondence, I think. Lucy, what makes Lucy so endearing, sometimes off-putting, is that she's very, very assertive, and she always tells her husband exactly what she thinks and how she's feeling. And so it really just does open a window into her mindset and her soul. And I think that's what makes the letter so engaging, because she won't take any gruff from him. And she says in one of the letters, this is before the Yorktown campaign, she says, after the war, I hope you will not think of yourself as the commander-in-chief of your own household. But I did consider other relationships and other families. The problem is that not many complete sets of letters between husbands and wives have survived in the Revolution. I mean, we all know John and Abigail Adams, that's the most famous. But the Knox's letters, there are about 200 overall that have survived, and they span the entire war. So again, you can see the war in all of its phases, but you can also track the evolution of and the growing maturity of their relationship with one another. Yeah.
Did Lucy ever get her house like Mount Vernon?
She did get an awfully big house, and after he was Secretary of War for Washington, Henry retires up to the frontier of Maine, which was then part of Massachusetts. And he builds a grand 26-room mansion called Montpelier, and it nearly bankrupts him in the process. But she did eventually get her house. And I think she was really the one who was behind adding so many wings and so many rooms to it, because she very much liked Mount Vernon, and she was brought up in a privileged household. Her father, again, was the royal secretary of the colony of Massachusetts Bay, and that was the third-ranking crown official in the colony. So he was a man of some substance, and she was used to the high life, so to speak. Yeah, yeah.
Did she and her family ever make up after the war? Or
No, yeah, I could give you the sad backstory to that. Yeah, she never does see any of her brothers or sisters or either of her parents again. There was some limited correspondence that begins after the war was over, but what the Fluckers really wanted was Henry to use his connections to help them get their confiscated property back, and he wasn't really willing to do that. He did help some, but it's pretty clear from the formality of the letters that they really weren't interested in reopening their emotional ties. And they had been very, very close beforehand. And so in some ways, it's a very tragic story of how the revolution was in some ways a civil war that permanently shattered families in the process.
Yeah. Where are these letters today?
The letters, the Knox letters are in what's called the Gilder-Lehrman collection, which is it's part of the Gilder-Lehrman Institute for American History. The letters, the physical copies of the letters, are actually in the same building as the New York Historical Society. So I went to New York and I did a lot of the transcriptions and the final versions of the transcriptions up there. So that's, and again, there are 200, but the Knox papers, I'm writing a larger biography of Henry Knox, slowly but surely, and his papers are in the Gilder-Lehrman collection. There are 10,000 items in that collection, so it takes, and he had terrible handwriting. That's the worst part, and so it makes it really hard to read sometimes. So it does take some time. I'm explaining to everyone why it's taking me so long to get this biography out. There's a reason for it. So, yeah. Any other questions? Yes. Yes.
I was sort of interested in Brian Kilmeade's book where he indicates that the British signal flags apparently got a stolen copy of those codes.
Yeah.
And I wondered if you had any feedback on that.
Well,
it was kind of sparse, but
yeah.
The indication was that they got a copy of those signal flags in the French fleet.
I haven't read that book, but I know it had to do with Washington spies and spy network, and Washington did keep a pretty elaborate network of spies in New York City, and that's how he found out that the North American squadron was preparing to sail.
They may have a contract to print those code books for the British Navy, but a copy of it got slipped out.
Well, that makes complete sense to me. I'm not aware of that story, but I think that Washington had very good tentacles into New York City, where the British were located, and Washington did get some good information in that manner. And that's a whole nother story in and of itself, a very interesting story. But again, because it's spies, because it's intelligence, there aren't a lot of records that give us kind of exactly what happened. When you're trying to keep something a secret, you don't write it down, and oftentimes it doesn't survive. But it wouldn't surprise me if Washington did get his hand on the signal books. Okay, well, thank you very much.
Thank you,
Appreciate
Dr.
it.
Hamilton.